Farmers are tough and resilient, but that doesn't mean they have to go it alone. When the stressors of farm life get to be too much, everyone needs someone to talk to. The Farm Family Wellness Alliance provides access to free, anonymous mental health and well-being services. Access starts at Together All and is available to any farmer in the United States and their family members aged 16 or older. Learn more and get your free account set up today.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's Farm Foundation Forum, Growing Together, Trends and Transformation in U.S. Agricultural Labor. We're glad to be able to engage with you and are thankful to Farm Credit for their support of this forum. My name is Tim Brennan. I'm Vice President of Programs and Strategic Impact here at Farm Foundation. I'm located on our No Innovation and Education campus in Libertyville, Illinois. I'm looking forward to today's discussion, which will highlight some of the findings from a recent multi-day symposium that explored the future of the U.S. agricultural workforce. Farm Foundation partnered with the Economic Research Service at the U.S. Department of Agriculture for that symposium, and we're pleased to be able to further examine some of the themes that emerged from that very important event. But before we get started with today's program, I'm going to take a few minutes to share a bit more about Farm Foundation. We're a 501c3 nonprofit working at the intersection of agriculture and society to address challenges that affect the entire food and ag value chain. Specifically, we're an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture, accelerating both people and ideas into action. The three levers we use to accomplish this are policy, innovation, and education. Forums such as today's are just one part of our extensive program of work, which is guided by our mission to build trust and understanding at the intersection of agriculture and society, and our vision to build a future for farmers, our communities, and our world. We rely on partnerships and coalitions to fund our work and increase our impact. So if you're interested in learning more about partnering with us, I encourage you to reach out. Now I'd like to take a minute to highlight our Friends of Farm Foundation program. With your enrollment as a friend, not only will you be helping to support the mission and vision of Farm Foundation, but you'll also gain extensive benefits such as our first reads of our issue reports, networking opportunities, and much more. Being a friend is an investment in building a better future for our farmers, our communities, and our world. To learn more about being a friend of Farm Foundation, please go to farmfoundation.org/friends, and the link is also being posted in the chat. In addition to learning more about Farm Foundation and our work by visiting our website, I encourage you to also connect with us on our social media platforms. If you're posting on social media about this morning's session, we ask that you use the hashtag Farm Foundation Forum, all one word. There's a few more housekeeping notes. There will be an audience answer and question session at the end. We'll be using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, not the chat to queue questions. This forum is also being recorded and we'll post it on our website, farmfoundation.org, as well as on our YouTube channel. And we'll send you a link for that after today's program. When the forum concludes, you'll also receive a link for a brief survey. Farm Foundation appreciates your feedback and your time in completing that survey. Now let's turn to today's forum on farm labor, a topic of great importance to U.S. agriculture. For the United States to remain competitive as a producer of fruit, vegetables, and other labor-intensive commodities, both private and government institutions will need to accelerate adaptation to a changing landscape of farm labor. We look forward to the insight that today's panel will provide. Today's panel of experts will be moderated by Michael Marsh. Michael serves as the CEO of the National Council of Agriculture Employers since 2017. After spending part of his career in public accounting, specializing in fraud investigation and forensic accounting, Michael began a new career in agricultural association management as the Director of Finance of the Almond Board of California. He also served as the CEO of California's largest dairy association and has consulted in the Federal District Court on complex financial transactions. Thank you for being our moderator today, Michael, and I'll pass it over to you.
Good morning, and thank you, Tim. I'd like us to run through a couple of slides. When I travel across the country, I see a lot of farmers and ranchers across the country. And of course, one of the biggest things that is imperiling their operations are the wage rates that they're having to pay. This is the adverse effect wage rate. And whether or not you're using the H-2A program or not, this is going to be impacting the wages that you have to pay on the farm. And when you look at it in comparison to some of our foreign competition, it's easy to understand exactly what's transpiring with regard to the exporting of much of our food production to our foreign competition, particularly Canada and Mexico. When we look at an adverse effect wage rate in California of $19.75 an hour versus about 300 pesos a day down in Mexico, which would equate to about $1.50 an hour, you can see the arbitrage opportunity that exists for Mexican producers to ship their product into the United States. Or take a situation like you have in North Dakota, and perhaps you're growing potatoes underneath a circle up in Saskatchewan, or growing them under a circle, irrigation circle up in North Dakota. 1077 in Saskatchewan versus 1832 in North Dakota. Clearly, we're not keeping pace with the rest of the world, and unfortunately, this is really jeopardizing a lot of those legacy family operations where folks hope to pass that legacy family farming operation on to the next generation. So unfortunately, we've got to figure out some way to fix this, and of course, we haven't seen the Congress really act on this issue since 1986, but let's go to the next slide, Morgan. Elections do have their consequences. We have had the presidential race has been called. The House of Representatives has not yet been called. And of course, we're going to have very slim margins in both the House of Representatives as well as in the Senate. We don't yet have a Department of Labor nominee yet from the former President-elect Trump. With regard to that part of his cabinet. However, we do have Marco Rubio has been nominated as Secretary of State, and Kristi Noem as the Secretary of Department of Homeland Security. And both of those agencies impact what happens with the H-2A program, and consequently, of course, the wages. Now, there are going to be very slim margins, both in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and that makes it extremely difficult to advance any type of ag labor reform. As I mentioned, we haven't seen any real ag labor reform legislation since 1986, and these programs really do need to change. There is a continuing resolution that will expire on December 20th, and at this time, of course, there are some lame duck plays that we've got with appropriations riders on behalf of farmers and ranchers in the United States. One would be an adverse effect wage rate freeze. Another one would also provide no such sums for the enforcement of a worker protection rule that has already been determined to be unconstitutional in 17 states, 17 states around the United States. NC and a number of our colleagues have had a couple of meetings now with Secretary Vilsack, and one of them included Acting Secretary Sue, to discuss the impact of the Farm Labor Survey with regard to the wage rates that are being set under the Adverse Effect Wage Rate Program for H-2A. And unfortunately, we've not come to any conclusion with regard to those discussions. But one of the challenges we've got is that actually the requirement that they use the average gross wages coming from the Farm Labor Survey exists over a regulation at the Department of Labor. So of course, that regulation has to be changed prior to any change that the Secretary Vilsack might make in the Farm Labor Survey having an impact on what farmers and ranchers have to pay. Now, at the same time, farm and ranch families across the United States have been under assault with a tsunami of new regulations promulgated by this administration. Over a period of about 18 months, we had 3,000 new pages of regulations that came down on farm and ranch families that were using the H-2A program. Extraordinary number of regulations, and of course right now I'm reviewing another proposed regulation on heat, and we'll be preparing comments here at the National Council on the heat regulation that's there, but that's another 1,640 pages all by itself. Let's go to the next slide, Morgan. Well, in the absence of the Congress actually doing what they're doing, we've seen what the regulatory agencies have been doing. They've been issuing regulations at a very rapid pace. But of course, there is another option if you object to those regulations, and that is in the area of litigation. And National Council has been very active here because we've had to try to turn back some of these regulations we've had over the past several years coming out of the administration. Of course, one of our cases involves the adverse effect wage rate in the Western District of Florida, and that addresses both the Farm Labor Survey determined wages as well as those wages that come from the OEWS, which is a survey done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics at the Department of Labor. It's important that we hopefully have a positive outcome to this litigation that we've got going, because it is also interesting that the magistrate who made the recommendations to the district court judge after oral argument in our case actually cited the Chevron case, Chevron versus NRDC case, 15 times in making a determination that we weren't eligible for a preliminary injunction. Hopefully the district court judge, now that Chevron has been determined and our motion for summary judgment, will in fact find in favor of America's farm and ranch families, so perhaps we can get some relief from wage rates disconnected from the marketplace for labor anywhere in the world. There's also been a similar suit brought in the state of North Carolina in a federal district court there. A part of that decision denying that preliminary injunction was already appealed to the Court of Appeals for that jurisdiction. In Louisiana, another case involving the same adverse effect wage rate regulation recently received a partial injunction with regard to some of the wages that were being paid to sugarcane workers hauling sugarcane from the field into the sugar mill. And it's just kind of curious because, of course, what we recognize is that under this new regime of wage regulations, it was as if the Department of Labor all of a sudden came to a conclusion that, wait a minute, we never used trucks on a farm, we never used tractors on a farm, we never did construction on a farm, and these are all wages that are now disaggregated, and we have to find another wage source for those. And unfortunately, that's not the case. There will be a new Farm Labor Survey published tomorrow, I believe, on the 20th, in which the Department of Agriculture will publish that survey, and of course the Department of Labor will pick that up and utilize that. But as I mentioned previously, about the only way you're going to change and move away from the Farm Labor Survey as a determinant for most of the wages paid under the H-2A program is to change the adverse effect wage rate methodology. Underneath the existing statutes, statutory authority for the H-2A program, the Secretary is supposed to make a determination on an annual basis that no adverse effect exists for domestic workers due to the employment of H-2A workers in this field. Unfortunately, the Secretary has not done that and hasn't done it for a while, so the NCA has petitioned the Secretary for a change in that methodology, and this week a writ of mandate will be filed in federal district court here in Washington, D.C. To mandate that the Secretary respond to the petition that we filed back in December of last year. There's also litigation taking place in the program rule, which was another regulation that came out from this administration, and that case is presently on appeal at the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals here in Washington. Next slide, Morgan. And of course, on the worker protection rule, this was a rule that was published by the Department of Labor in 2023 that was many farm and ranch families found it to be offensive, just the pejorative nature of the regulation when it came out. There was litigation that was brought by NCAE member, Georgia Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association down in the district court down in Georgia, and it was joined in their litigation by 17 attorneys generals. Now, what has occurred with regard to the determination of that litigation by that district court judge is that this worker protection rule has been enjoined now in 17 states. The court's language was very, very tough with regard to the Department of Labor and the publication of this rule that they did after they made it a final rule. But unfortunately, the Department of Labor did not take into consideration all of the recommendations that came from this district court judge. And so now we've got one set of regulations that exists in 17 states under this regulation, and another rule for everybody else in the rest of the country under the other 33 states. North Carolina Farm Bureau Federation has brought litigation in North Carolina to address this worker protection rule there as well in that state. And in Mississippi, a hearing was held just yesterday with our NCA member, International Fresh Produce Association, and American Farm Bureau Federation, among others, at a hearing also challenging the constitutionality of this regulation. Now, as I mentioned, it's already been found to be unconstitutional in 17 states. And of course, the litigation in North Carolina and Mississippi seek to also expand that to the other 33 states. But, Morgan, we have breaking news. Let's go to the next slide. 2 weeks ago, the National Council of Ag Employers testified on the worker protection rule in a hearing in the Western District of Kentucky. It was interesting to hear the court because it almost appeared as if the judge was saying, it looks like the Department of Labor was had developed a fix that was actually looking for a problem. The judge's thoughts also after the conclusion of the testimony by the witnesses, growers as well as association executives, the judge's thoughts was how we're kind of around a couple of themes. One is that how in the world the Department of Labor could ignore the U.S. Supreme Court's determination in a case called Cedar Point Nursery versus Hasid that challenged successfully the constitutionality or the lack of constitutionality of a regulation issued by the Ag Labor Relations Board out in California, which actually granted unions access to the farms. And they found it to be unconstitutional under the under the Fifth and the 14th Amendments of the Constitution in an opinion penned by Chief Justice John Roberts. That was one of the court's concerns, was now under this worker protection rule, they kind of did an end run around the Supreme Court. But not only did they do that, but they also made an end run around the U.S. Congress in that the National Labor Relations Act of 1935 prohibitively exempted agricultural employees from unionization efforts. It was interesting to hear the Department of Justice attorney representing the Department of Labor in this hearing say these were only incremental changes that were being made to the regulation, which the judge clearly wasn't buying. And then, of course, the court was also concerned with the Department of Labor's remedy in this action, where he carved out where the remedy for DOL was, instead of getting rid of the whole rule, having one rule exist in 17 states and another rule exist in the other 33. Also, another point that the judge raised is, how does this not fly in the face of Chevron deference? Why should we give this kind of deference to this regulatory agency and ignore the will of the Congress as well as the will of the U.S. Supreme Court? So it was a very interesting opportunity for NCU to once again challenge some of these regulations in federal district court, and we're anticipating any day now, and perhaps even yet today, that we will receive a determination from the district court judge in Kentucky, finding, as the district court judge did in Georgia, that this regulation is unconstitutional and cannot stand. Now, moving into the meat of our program, I'm very excited because we have got some really great speakers to visit with you today. The first speaker, I would like to open up the conversation with our first panelist, Dr. Philip Martin. He is Professor Emeritus of Agriculture and Resource Economics at the University of California at Davis and edits the publication Rural Migration News. By the way, it's a great publication if you get a chance and you're interested in agricultural labor. He is also the author of numerous research publications on migration and farm labor, and he was the only researcher appointed to the Federal Commission on Agricultural Workers that evaluated the impacts of immigration reform on U.S. farm workers. His most recent book is Bracero 2.0, Mexican Workers in North American Agriculture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Philip Martin.
Well, good morning. And as I share my screen, I thank Michael and Farm Foundation and everyone who got up so early this morning. Let me just say that my main message is that the gap between lower farm earnings and higher non-farm earnings is closing, is narrowing. And there doesn't look to be many factors that will slow that increase. So for most of the 20th century, average hourly earnings in agriculture were about half of average hourly earnings in the non-farm economy. And that explains why an enormous number of people moved from agriculture to non-farm industries. That gap started to narrow and is now about 60%. So if you work in agriculture, the average hourly earnings are about 60% of what they are in the non-farm sector. And if current trends continue, that gap will continue to narrow. So the main message then is that farm labor costs are going up. And there are three major responses to that narrowing of the gap. The first is to mechanize hand jobs. Second is to import migrant H-2A workers. And the third is to change crops in the US and simply import labor-intensive commodities from those countries that Michael showed have lower wages. So the first question is, why are farm wages going up faster than non-farm wages? Well, the main reason is that the demand for farm workers has been relatively stable at about 1.5 million. So what that means is that if you take a snapshot of employment each month, add it up and divide by 12, you'll get about 1.5 million. It's higher in the summer months, 1.8, 1.9 million, lower in the winter months because we have seasonality. And then there's also turnover. Some workers try agriculture, don't stay very long. So it takes about 2.5 million unique workers to fill those 1.5 million jobs. The big change in the last, say, in the 21st century, the last 2 decades, has been the rise in what the government calls crop support. So when we think of people or see people working in a field, we normally think of them as being hired by the farm operator of that particular farm. But that is no longer true in California. In California, 60% of all crop workers are brought to farms by what the government calls crop support services. The largest single part of that are labor contractors. About half of H-2A workers are brought to farms by crop support services, and about 40% of workers across the US. So the big story is the outsourcing of farm labor. Sometimes this is done for corporate reasons. So on a corporate farm, there could be a trucking division, a farming division, a labor division. But in many other cases, it's really outsourcing to an independent entity. Then, of course, the big question is, why are wages going up? Why are farm wages going up? Well, the fundamental reason economists would say is demand is greater than supply. But other reasons include the fact that many states have high minimum wages. The federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour. The California minimum wage is $16 an hour. Washington's a little higher. And then the adverse effect wage rate that Michael was talking about is a special minimum wage put in place to protect US and these H-2A guest workers. So we have those reasons over time, and then regulations on everything from health and safety to other things. So wages are going up because demand is more stable than supply. Supply is shrinking of US workers. Of those US workers that in the United States, about 80% were born in Mexico, and about 500,000, 2 million born in Mexico, 500,000 born in the US. Of those Mexican workers, most are settled. That is, they may be legal, they may be unauthorized, but they're settled in the United States. And their average age is in the early 40s. There's another 300,000, almost all from Mexico, migrant H-2A workers. They're younger, and because they're selected, they're recruited to be farm workers, they tend to be higher productivity. So it all adds up to the fact that the rising labor costs mean we're getting more mechanization as well as mechanical aids that make the work easier, more migrants, more imports. And the question is, what do you do? If we look at the farm labor system as a whole, you think of it almost as a super tanker in the middle of the ocean. It's really hard to turn around, but you can nudge it in 1 or 2 degrees in a particular direction. The big changes in the last several decades have been the decline of ag exceptions. It used to be, as was mentioned before, back in the 1930s, when many of the federal labor laws were passed, agriculture was excluded. So agriculture was excluded from Social Security, from unemployment insurance, from minimum wage regulation. Those exceptions started to disappear in the 1950s and 1960s. And today, farm work is regulated pretty much like non-farm work, with exceptions like the union thing that Michael mentioned. The workers who have settled in the US are working more days. Many of them are working 200 days a year. Full-time in the United States is typically considered about 250 days a year. And the US educated children of especially seasonal workers tend to climb the US job ladder, and that means getting out of agriculture. I mentioned that outsourcing of labor to crop support services, mostly labor contractors. I think it's important to emphasize that labor contractors include some of the best and some of the worst farm employers. Labor contractors can be win-win for employers who need workers only seasonally and for workers who are seeking seasonal jobs. They can also be risk absorbers for violations of tax, immigration, labor, and other laws. And the challenge is, how do you regulate labor contractors who have been around for a long time and have proven to be very, very difficult to regulate effectively? One thing that we tend to paint farm labor with a broad brush and not realize how different it can be. One of the things that we have been exploring is how you can recognize that some employers, some farm employers, and some migrant workers are lawful, do comply with laws. Can you develop something like a TSA pre-check system to allow those employers to skip some of the regulations because they have shown themselves to be law-abiding? Can farm work, seasonal farm work, done by migrants from other countries, can it become something like the FIFO system, so that's called fly in, fly out, that we have in most remote mining and oil drilling places? So almost nobody who works on the North Slope of Alaska lives there. People fly in, the minimum number of people fly in, they get the work done, and they fly out. We've got a lot of buyer certification, and of course, are we ever going to integrate things? So the last slide before I show some pictures is just, what do the next 5 years look like? I think it's important when you look back. During Trump's first term, there weren't big changes to the H-2A program. There was an expansion of the H-2A program. The Farm Workforce Modernization Act was approved by the House in 2019, but the regulations that came under Trump really didn't get put in place until near the end, and then they were reversed right away or withheld by the Biden administration. Under Mr. Biden, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act was approved by the House again, and then came a lot of H-2A changes, which are the subject of the litigation that Michael was talking about. We went from one adverse effect wage rate per state to adverse effect wage rates by occupation, which meant you could get up to 10. We got the worker protection regulations, and the question is, if the courts do block these regulations, will Mr. Trump 2.0 reverse them, just as has happened when Obama took over from George W. Bush and happened when Mr. Biden took over from Mr. Trump 1.0. We don't yet know what will happen under Trump 2.0. It could be that H-2A will be made much easier and cheaper. That is, freeze or modify the adverse effect wage rate, open up the program to year-round jobs, maybe change the housing requirement, or, as Project 2025 says, phase out the H-2A program and subsidize mechanization. It's hard to really predict the future. In economics, we say you can become famous without ever being right. Remember, those people predict what's going to happen in the stock market. But I think it seems clear that there's going to be fewer unauthorized newcomers. So kind of the fresh blood in the farm workforce is going to be H-2A. And it seems inevitable. We're going to get more machines, probably more controlled environment agriculture, and probably more imports unless we get into a trade war. So just a little background and then bring it home. One is US agriculture is big. We're divided into 30 plus sectors. But when we look at farm wages, it's only 5 sectors that really account for 2/3 of all the farm wages that are paid. The number one is crop support, then comes greenhouse and nurseries, then fruits and nuts, then dairy, and then vegetables. We don't know where the crop support workers are employed, but most of them are employed in fruits and nuts and vegetables, which is why those wage bills of $6 billion and $10 billion can be deceptive, because farmers in those commodities are actually paying more, but they're paying it to workers via those crop support services. Labor contractors, of course, are the people who primarily bring seasonal workers to farms. They're 55% of all what the government calls crop support employment. They are a lower share of wages because the wages that labor contractors pay tend to be lower than the wages received by direct hire workers. There are roughly 10,000 people who are licensed, but there's only a little over 3,000 labor contracting businesses. You need to be licensed to recruit and to drive workers. And the big question is always, do labor contractors increase efficiency in the labor market, helping both farmers and workers, or are they risk absorbers for violations of labor laws? Labor contractors are most important in commodities. So we have the two wage systems, hourly wage systems and piece rate wage systems. Piece rate wage systems are used when it's easier to count the output of a worker than it is the effort of the worker. So in picking tree fruit, it's hard to see if people are working in trees, but you can count the bins picked. And we tend to associate labor contractors harvesting with piece rate wages in many commodities. We often overlook greenhouse and nursery, but there are a lot of people employed there. They tend to be in year-round jobs. They're often in more urban environments. And one thing that is growing very rapidly with the support of venture capital is the production of tomatoes and other vegetables, as well as berries, in some kind of a protected structure, often offering year-round jobs close to consumers. Fruits and nuts, we have 6 major fruit and nut crops. They each hire 20 to 30,000 workers across the US directly. They each paid about $1 billion or more in wages to their direct hire workers. Apples is the largest, followed by grapes, strawberries, and then other berries like blueberries and raspberries, then tree nuts, and then non-citrus fruits like everything from cherries to peaches. So that's the demand side. The supply side is that we have primarily Mexican-born workers who have, most of whom have US-born children. And we know that children educated in the United States rarely become seasonal workers. And when we look across the United States, we realize that we have a huge gap in minimum wages. The minimum wages on the West Coast can be twice what the minimum wages are in the Southeast. And what that means is that farmers looking ahead, farmers who are producing what are labor-intensive commodities, are having to decide, what do I do over the next 5 to 10 years? Do I try to invest in labor-saving machines? Do I invest in housing and hire migrant H-2A workers? Or do I change crops in the US and look to import from abroad? We've mechanized a whole lot of commodities. Many commodities, if you remember at the end of the Bracero program in the early 1960s, 80% of the workers picking processing tomatoes, so those are the little tomatoes that are turned into ketchup and other commodities, were braceros. And you can read the congressional testimony that yes, mechanization will come, but not for 20 years. In fact, mechanization came in about 5 years because the Bracero program ended in 1964, and we were able to very quickly mechanize. Now, of course, it was not a mechanization and leaving everything unchanged. After you spend $500,000 on a harvester in 1965 dollars, you're going to specialize in processing tomatoes. So we went from many farms producing a few tomatoes and picking them by hand to a few farms producing lots of tomatoes and picking them with machines. The issue of investing in machines is that it's very expensive to produce lots of some of the commodities. For example, our biggest crops are the 90 million acres of corn and soybeans, and really cost of production are somewhere around $1,000 or a little more per acre. But when we look at something like strawberries, we're talking $100,000 an acre to produce them. Raspberries, $150,000 an acre. And so the question for someone looking to mechanize is, what do you do? Do you adapt a machine to the current farming system, or do you change the farming system so that you can use the machine? And of course, changing the farming system is easiest if you move it indoors into a controlled environment. When we look at the companies that are trying to replace hand pickers, it's tough. A robotic strawberry harvester, for example, can pick 50 to 70% of the fruit. But most farmers cannot afford to lose up to half their fruit. So you have hand workers follow and pick what the machine missed, and then you wind up packing both the machine picked and the hand picked fruit in a packing shed. Robots may come to apples before they do strawberries, in part because a robot produces the same output as a picker, that is a hand picker, that is a bin of apples, 925 pounds of apples. The problem for the robot is that it's really hard to find the apples. You've got branches and leaves, and you don't want to drop the apple. And so the basic idea is cameras and grippers. And if you think about exactly how these robots work, the robots are not yet fast enough or cheap enough to be able to compete with hand pickers. The robots are getting better. The hand pickers are probably as fast as they'll ever be, but we don't know exactly when that crossover point is. The technical part of this is really pretty simple. We assume that a person who picks an apple or strawberry roughly every 2 seconds is about 95% efficient. That is, they get 95% of the marketable fruit. But if you think of what a machine's got to do, it's got to detect the fruit, it's got to position itself, then it's got to pick it, then it's got to convey it. And even if it's 95% efficient at each of those things, the overall efficiency is 80%. So that means a grower who uses only a robot would lose 20% of the crop. And the question is, can you afford to do that? And the second question is, will a venture capital that's funding these robotic companies be patient enough until they get better? The in-between solution is mechanical aids, that is, get rid of the ladders and put hydraulic platforms out there. There is a culture change because you move from individual to shared or crew piece rate wages. And so sometimes people don't want to work with slower people. And so those are the options other than H2A. So the H2A, of course, is that we can wind up using the H2A program to bring in farm workers to fill seasonal jobs. So we just got the new numbers. It did go up a little bit, but it was a very small increase between 2023 and 2024. We don't yet exactly know why, but it's still the same story. The big 5 states of Florida, Georgia, California, Washington, and North Carolina accounted for half of all the certifications, and we'll see once how that proceeds. But H2As have traditionally been concentrated in the southeastern states. The reason that's important is the southeastern states are where state minimum wages tend to be much lower. But half of all hired farm workers are in the Pacific states, a third in California, about 10% in Washington, and about 5% in Oregon. So the growth is likely to be in the Pacific states. And the big issue is, what's going to be the race between farmers moving for H2As versus the regulation of the H2A program? There has been a big increase in the amount or the pages of regulations. And the overall story is that H2As in a state like California cost roughly $30 an hour or more, whereas a US worker, $16 minimum wage and payroll taxes is about $20 an hour. Now, at the outset, you would say, why would you ever hire H2As? Well, when you think about it, H2As are more productive. The second is they provide labor insurance. And the third is there's no Social Security tax on Medicare. So that saves about 8% on the earnings of H2A workers. US workers are more diverse. H2A workers tend to be in their 20s and 30s. And of course, they can change employers if they want to earn more. I already mentioned, what do we do about H2A? Do you wait for Congress to enact something? Or are there things you could do to separate out good the good employers who identify themselves. Many people hoped that the Farm Workforce Modernization Act would pass. It was passed by the House. It would basically repeat IRCA of 1986, but with some twist. Under IRCA, if you were unauthorized and you did farm work, you became an immigrant, just like a regular immigrant after a few years, but only the farm worker got an immigrant visa, not his or her family. Under the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, you have to continue to do farm work, but then you and your family can become immigrant. Streamline the H-2A program with 3-year visas and visas in year-round jobs, and study the AWAR and decide if it's really needed. Also, E-Verify. So H-2A, we have mechanization, H-2A. The third option is imports. It's important to recognize we already import most of our fresh fruit and 40% of our fresh vegetables. And Mexico is the #1 source because the fruits and vegetables can be trucked into the United States. The big 3 Mexican fresh exports to the US are tomatoes, avocados, and berries. And remember, avocados are one where Mexico has comparative advantage with lower wages, and also in some cases with putting up, like most of the fresh vegetables, many of the berries are picked under protective structure, some form of controlled environment in agriculture that protects the growing plants. Mexico is producing a lot of commodities, not for Mexicans, but for Americans. So most of the cucumbers, asparagus, broccoli produced in Mexico is exported to the US, and so are lots of commodities that Mexicans eat a lot of, including avocados and tomatoes, but a big share are exported to the US. So what's going to happen in the 2020s? I mean, we had a 1960s, we call it a hinge moment in history. The farm labor market changed enormously in the 1960s when there were a lot of similarities. Demand was bigger than supply, wages were going up, we had a lot of mechanization, we had unions, and farm labor was front page news in a lot of cases. We thought that IRCA, 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, would bring about another farm labor hinge in the 1990s. It did not happen, primarily because the newly legalized special agricultural workers got out of agriculture. They were replaced by unauthorized migrants, and labor contractors and unauthorized workers spread, with labor contractors being the risk absorbers. Today, we have a similar situation as the 1960s, demand greater than supply, wages up, mechanization, imports. We're trying to figure out exactly what that mix of factors is going to leave us. We do know that there's been this narrowing of the farm, non-farm earnings gap. We know about the overtime rules, health and safety, card check. It's probable that not many of those new laws will be rolled back. We know that buyers of fresh produce are requiring more satisfaction of protocols. There's NGOs out there certifying. But the real question is, to my mind, is what do we do about the hard to regulate labor contractor share of employment? What are the business models? Are labor contractors mostly risk absorbers, or are they mostly something that increases efficiency in the labor market? I mean, one of the big puzzles is why do the people who build up a labor contracting business, why don't they get bought and sold? Why don't we have a manpower out there with labor contracting franchises taking advantage of, if it's a very profitable business, of the profits? But the big question we ask is, what is the future of labor-intensive ag? Is it mechanization and keeping it in the United States? Is it moving to controlled environment near cities? Is it importing migrants and keeping ham production as it is in the US? Or is it importing more fruits and vegetables? As Michael said, we prepare a newsletter, Rural Migration News. It's easy to Google. The one thing that we are trying to do is look around the world. And the one thing to realize, as soon as you look around, no country has solved the seasonal farm labor problem. Whether you're in Australia or the UK or Spain or Germany, they are debating many of the very same issues we're debating. How do you protect local workers when migrants come in? What do you do about unauthorized workers? What do you do about labor contractors? Over there, it's often staffing agencies. How do you regulate them effectively? So it's not something that has easy answers. The hope is that we can make incremental progress toward coming to an answer. Thank you very much for your patience. I'll now stop sharing and we will move on to the next person.
Thank you, Philip. That was great. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Andrew Padovani. Andrew is the director of the National Ag Workers Survey, or we also refer to that as the NAS. The NAS is a nationwide employment-based random sample survey of U.S. crop workers collecting demographic, employment, and health data in face-to-face interviews. It's a fascinating survey that Dr. Padovani does. Prior to the NAS, Dr. Padovani managed and contributed to large-scale surveys used in statewide evaluations of mental health intervention programs funded by the California Department of Mental Health Services. Thank you for joining us today, Andrew.
Thanks, Michael. All right, good morning, everybody. As Michael said, I'm Andrew Padovani. I'm the director of the National Agricultural Workers Survey, or the NAS. Morgan, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So the NAS is a national study of crop workers. We interview migrant and seasonal workers, where they are in the fields. Currently, we do not interview H-2A workers. And I want to mention we also don't interview dairy workers or workers who work in any kind of livestock. So it's just crop workers. We are the primary source of national and regional information about crop workers. We collect demographic information, employment information, health information, and the data we collect goes into multiple federal programs for farm workers, such as the National Farm Worker Jobs Program, Migrant Seasonal Head Start, migrant health programs, migrant education programs. The NAS has been running since 1988, actually, about 35 years now. So we have continuous data collection throughout the year. We are a multi-stage stratified random sample. That is, we draw randomly what we call farm labor areas from within each of these regions of the United States. So each region is a different color. Most regions are made up of multiple states, with the exception of California and Florida, the largest ag employment states in the country. And those are individual regions. We sample those separately. We interview between 1,100 and 3,600 workers every year, and we conduct those. Those are one-on-one, in-person interviews. Crop workers are interviewed at their place of employment, or at least they're sampled at their place of employment. Sometimes we will schedule interviews to take place, after work or before work, so not necessarily on the farm itself. And we have publicly available data. DOL, ETA hosts data on their website for public use, and that includes aggregated regions, so combinations of some of these regions into regions we call super regions. There is restricted data available that includes the county of interview, and that can be applied for at the DOL, on the DOL website. Next slide, please, Morgan. Thank you. So we collect demographic characteristics of the worker and the worker's economic unit, and that could be their family who they live with in the United States, or that could be a family that they support abroad. So for example, they could be a Mexican worker who comes to the United States temporarily or seasonally and send money back home, and we would collect information about their family that they're supporting back home. We collect information about the types of housing units they live in, how much they pay in rent or mortgage. We collect information about their farm jobs, say their pay arrangement, piece rate, hourly, combination, or some other kind of arrangement. We collect a 12-month employment history, and it's really more than just an employment history. It's really a 12-month history. That is, we collect periods of employment and farm work and the different employers that they've had, And we also collect information about non-farm work that they might be doing in between periods of farm work. We collect periods of non-work and periods spent abroad, where they might be at home for part of the year. We collect information about their family income, their personal income, what kind of assets they own, what kind of assistant programs they might use. So, for example, if they use the National Farm Worker Jobs Program, or participate in any kind of on-the-job training, or other kinds of adult education programs. We collect information about chronic health and whether they have been diagnosed with certain types of health conditions, such as high blood pressure or high cholesterol, asthma, and a few others. And then we also ask information about health coverage for themselves and their family, if they have family in the United States. Next slide, please. All right, so I want to talk a bit about some of the demographic changes that we've been seeing over the last 3 decades of the NAS. So the first and the kind of highlight change that has been happening over time is that farm workers are getting older, and there's not a lot of new workers coming into the labor force. So what I have plotted here is the distribution of workers by age. So along the horizontal axis at the bottom, we have 5-year age bins from 14 to 65 or older, or 64 or older. The blue line, which is very high on the left-hand side of the screen and low on the right-hand side of the screen, is the age distribution of crop workers in the early period of the NAS. So this would be the late 80s and early 90s. And you can see about 20% of crop workers, that's 1 in 5 workers, were aged between 19 and 23. So these were very young workers who probably were just entering the United States and primarily engaging in crop work. And you can see there's not very many older workers. So about less than 5% of workers were older than 49 and in those higher age groups. But over time, so the orange line is about the middle of the last 35 years, 2006 to 2009. You can see the younger workers, they're falling off, and we have more older workers. And then finally, the green line is what it looks like in the last 5 years. Many fewer younger workers, so that 19 to 23 age group is only comprised of about 1 in 10 workers now. And this line is higher for the older worker group, so 29, 34 to 38, 39 to 43, and higher for all of the older age groups as well. So the main takeaway from this plot is that workers are getting older and there's a lot fewer younger workers. Thanks, Morgan. As Philip mentioned, most of these workers are born in Mexico. So about 60%, a little more than 60% of all crop workers are born in Mexico. About a third are born in the US and Puerto Rico. And a small percentage are born in other places like Central America. And we even interview workers from places like South Africa. And there's even a few Eastern Europeans in there as well. Next slide, please. Among foreign-born workers, which is the majority of foreign-born workers, about 40%, among Mexican workers, most of the Mexican workers are coming from Western Central Mexico. And then about a quarter are coming from Northern Mexico and Southern Mexico. So Western Central Mexico would be just south of the US border. Next slide, please. IQC. So Northern Mexico here is the blue sections. I think the last slide actually had the legend was actually incorrect. think this blue line is actually North Mexico. But let's move back to the next slide. So northern Mexico states are states like Sonora, Baja California, Chihuahua, and then we have western central Mexico includes Jalisco, Michoacan, and Mexico City, and then southern Mexico is the southernmost part of Mexico, Yucatan, Oaxaca, Veracruz. Let's go to the next slide, please. So in the NOS, we also collect information about where workers were just before they came to the US to do crop work. And we call those the sending regions. And we're going to specifically look at Mexican workers. So Mexican workers are primarily coming from that western central Mexico. I think it's actually northern Mexico. And then a lot of workers were coming from northern Mexico, but that has fallen off in the later years. And so now we have more workers coming from the southern Mexican states. So as North Mexico has, the economy has improved, education levels have improved, the workers are coming from farther and farther away from southern Mexico, which is a bit poorer, more rural than the northern parts of Mexico. Next slide, please. Oh, let's go back. Yeah, thank you. So as I mentioned, we collect information about chronic health conditions. And over time, we've been seeing, as the workers have aged, we're seeing more workers being diagnosed with high blood pressure, more workers being diagnosed with diabetes and asthma. And that's no surprise, as these workers are getting older. They're spending a lot of time doing farm work, which is very hard work and in harsh conditions. We are starting to ask questions about HIV, high cholesterol, cancer. So it'll be interesting to see how those develop over time. Next slide, please. Okay, next we'll talk about some information on employment and income. Next slide, Morgan. Thank you. So in the NOS, we ask questions about legal status. So we ask workers what kind of work authorization they have, and they can tell us whether they're unauthorized workers, and many do. But we also ask detailed questions about the programs they tell us they've applied to for work authorization, and we do our best to check those responses against how the programs work themselves. So we try to catch when workers are not being so forthcoming about their work status. But we do find about 58% of workers have legal status or are legal authorized workers, and that has actually gone up quite a bit over the years. Still, about 40% of workers are unauthorized, but it's down from being the majority of workers being unauthorized in the late 90s. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we ask among workers who say they have authorization, how did they receive their authorization? You can see in the early part of the NOS, the vast majority, 2/3 of authorized workers received their work authorization under an IRCA amnesty rule. So there were two paths to citizenship or work authorization in IRCA, and that was the Seasonal Agriculture Worker 90-day program. And there was also a 5-year program. I believe the 5-year program was you had to do crop work for 5 years, and then you could apply for work authorization. So, 3/4 of workers in the early 90s received their work authorization through IRCA. And then over time, we have many fewer workers this was a one-time thing that was only available in the late 80s. So the share of workers who are still in the workforce who have gotten their work authorization under this program is shrinking over time. And now today, about 2/3 of the workers who have work authorization have received it through some kind of spousal petition or a family unity program. Let's move on. So looking at wages, wages are going up over time. This is the real wage, that is, it is adjusted for inflation and expressed in 2022 dollars. So in the early 90s, in 2022 dollars, workers were earning about $10 an hour. Today, that's gone up a little over 50%, and the average worker is making about $15 an hour. So this is averaged over all of the regions in the United States. So there's quite a bit of variation. In California, wages are much higher. In the Midwest, wages are much lower. And in the South, particularly, wages are much lower. But overall, wages have gone up about 50% in real terms, adjusted for inflation. Next slide, please. Housing costs, however, have gone up substantially more. Housing costs have gone up again, this is on average with lots of regional variation, but on average, nationally, rents have gone up about 140% over the same time period. So in the mid 90s, it was workers were paying about $364 for their housing. And today they're paying almost $900. And again, with lots of regional variation. It's higher in the West, lower in the South, where there's more building happening, less housing regulation. Oh, thank you, Morgan, for moving the slides. Farm work weeks has gone up as well. So the average worker was working about 27 weeks, 25 weeks in the early 90s, and that's increased by about 3 months. So all the way to 37 weeks. So the average worker is working about 37 weeks out of the year. Again, with regional variation, in some regions, it's as many as 40 weeks a year. And then other regions, say the north near Canada, is a bit lower. Thank you. We ask workers, so because we collect a 12-month history, we can estimate how many farm work days workers are working in a year, and we can look at that across or by age. So we can see that across the age distribution, farm work weeks has increased substantially over time. So there was a bit of slow growth in the 90s, and now today, that green line, almost all age groups are working a lot more farm work days per year, over 200 days per year, almost 250 days per year in many cases. The younger workers, kind of interestingly, though, those workers haven't really increased. They're working about the same number of days a year in farm work that 19-year-olds were working in the early 90s. So young workers are still working less, but older workers are now, as these workers have aged, the workers who are kind of less attached have moved out of the labor force. So we really have we're kind of left with the core workers who are really attached to the labor force. Next slide, please, Morgan. We ask workers about their plans to remain in farm work, and we can look at this over time. So I've picked out, we look at just the less than 1 year to 3 years. So these are workers who have said they plan to stay in farm work for less than a year to 3 years, so less than 3 years, 4 to 5 years, or as long as able in the green line. Most workers say that they plan to stay in farm work as long as they are able, and that's been pretty stable over time, although we've seen a little bit of increase in the 2010s, with a little bit fewer workers saying they plan to stay in crop work short term. Next slide, please, Morgan. And lastly, I wanted to look at farm work attachment. That is, so the way I've measured attachment here is the share of the last 12 months, that is we call it their employment history, that they tell us they're spent in farm work, doing crop work. So in the early 90s, workers told us they were spending about 50% of the last 12 months in crop work. Today, the workers we interview tell us that they are spending about 70% of their time of the last 12 months in crop work. So we have the workers we're interviewing are more attached to farm work. They're more reliant on farm work for their income. And their non-farm activities, their non-farm work activities have changed a bit. So this yellow line is the time that they spent abroad. So in the early 90s, our workers were spending about 20% of their time abroad, that is outside of the United States. Today, that is much lower, only about 5% of their time is spent outside of the United States. And they're spending more time doing non-farm work than workers were in the 2000s, for example. All right, next slide. And that's it. Thank you, everybody, for your time and your patience this morning. My contact information is there on the screen, and if you have questions or want to talk more to us, feel free to reach out. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Andrew. That's excellent work. And if anyone is interested, please go to the Department of Labor website and look for the National Ag Worker Survey. It's just chock full of really good information if you're interested in this topic at all. And if you have questions, again, for the audience, please put them in the Q&A box there, and we'll get to those at the end of the discussion. For our final speaker today, we're going to hear from Dr. Alexandra Hill. Ali is an assistant professor of cooperative extension in the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research centers around the U.S. agricultural workforce and seeks to demonstrate how a variety of factors impact worker well-being, quantified in terms of income or health impacts, and to demonstrate how these factors then impact businesses in terms of key performance indicators like productivity, output quality, profits, and workplace injuries. Welcome, Ali. Good to see you.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to share my own slides. There we go. Cool. So hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm actually joining you from Mexico because we're going to get an update of the data I'll be showing you today. So kind of apt timing if anyone has any additional things they're interested in learning. So what I'll be talking about, I'm calling the U.S. Farm Workforce Outlook, but really the story here is going to focus on what the last two M's and what Phil introduced today. So migrants, really focusing on supplementing our current workforce with H-2A workers, and I guess one M and one I, and imports. So essentially, yeah, well, that's what most of the Mexican data is going to be used for. The work I'm presenting is co-authored with James Sayer, who's at UC Davis. And yeah, he's really the expert on all the Mexico ag workforce and ag production data. So I might have to ask him follow-up questions if there are ones I can't answer. Cool. So I will start off with giving you the main takeaways from my talk today. So really, I guess these points have already kind of been made. I'm going to go into more detail and be bringing in data from Mexico to speak to what's happening on either side of the border. So the main thing that Phil introduced really well, Andrew went into, is that domestic farm employees are going to continue to be harder and harder to find. They're going to continue to be more and more expensive to employ. I'll give you some reasons why I think those trends are going to continue, but I think we can all kind of deduce it. The H-2A program offers a temporary and very promising solution for that first point, so that workers are going to be harder and harder to find. I'll show you data comparing Mexico and US farm wages to show you that the H-2A wages in particular are going to be attractive for a very large number of Mexican farm workers for a while. I think it'll take large shocks to Mexico agricultural production to get the wages more competitive. But the question that I'm really interested in here is, will these high costs reduce U.S. agricultural competitiveness, driving some production to Mexico? So essentially replacing some U.S. production with increasing imports from Mexico. And then I'll kind of end with what I think the takeaways are for U.S. farm employers if they want to stay in business, is we're going to have to find ways to reduce labor or other input costs or increase revenues. So we'll come back to these at the end. So for right now, we'll just get into this. This has been talked about, so I won't spend a ton of time on it, but I just want to give you one slide on why are farm employees harder and harder to find. I'll give you two reasons. One is that workers are more settled. So if we compare over the last 20 years, one of the most striking trends that we see in the National Agricultural Workers Survey is that there's fewer migrant workers. So in 2000, about half the workforce was migrant. Today, it's about 15%. So in farm work, this is really meaningful because it's not just the number of people in the workforce that is important. It's we need workers when and where they are needed in accordance with, crop production cycles. So having fewer migrant workers is really impactful for the industry. The second trend is that we have fewer new immigrant workers. So compared with 20 years ago, 20% fewer of our workers are foreign born. The workforce is aging. The average worker has more farm experience. And I want to make the point that this is not because we're having an exodus of farm workers from agriculture. So this particular question in the NAS asks workers, how long do you intend to continue to work in agriculture? And for the response, as long as I am able, that's been really steady across time. So in 2000, 70% of workers shared this intention. Today, it's 74%. So the vast majority of our farm workforce wants to continue working in agriculture. The issue is we're not getting a new influx of people into agriculture. And so that's what I'm going to be breaking down in some data from Mexico as a potential explainer of why we're not getting this new immigrant workforce. So why focus on Mexico? The vast majority of our foreign-born workers come from Mexico. So today, 90%, in 2000, 97%. So it's important to understand what's going on in Mexico to draw implications for the US. So there's two negative trends happening in Mexico. The first is that there's fewer people working in agriculture. So this is using data from the Mexican population census and some intercensus surveys. So in 1970, around 35% of Mexican citizens were working in agriculture. In 2020, that's down to 10%. So we have fewer people with agricultural experience, which is going to limit the number of people coming to US to work in agriculture, reduce the number. The second point is that just like what's happening in the US, just like what's happening in most countries globally, the farm workforce is aging. Workers in other industries are also aging. So we're having lower birth rates. This is going to show up as just a smaller availability of people to come to the US to work in agriculture, right? So we have these two negative trends, but there is one positive trend in terms of getting more workers into the farm workforce in the US. And I'm going to spend a second and just break down this slide for you. So let's start with these blue lines. So these top three lines, this solid one is giving from 2017 to 2022, the change in the average hourly wage rate of US farm workers using data from the National Agricultural Workers Survey. So this is corresponding with these blue numbers on this left y-axis. So in 2022, the average farm worker was earning almost let's say $15.50 an hour. And then this top line is showing you the maximum of all states in the US of the H-2A AWAR, the adverse effect wage rate. So in 2022, workers could earn up to $17.50 an hour under that minimum hourly wage rate for being in the H-2A visa program. The minimum across all states was at $12 an hour. So coming to the US under the H-2A visa program, you would at minimum earn $12 an hour if you went to, the lowest paying states. By comparison, this right-hand axis is giving the average hourly wage rate of farm workers in Mexico. And I put that on a separate axis because otherwise it's really hard to see these numbers if they're on the same axis, but the numbers here are quite telling. So this solid line is the average across all farm workers and all occupations in Mexico. They're earning on average $160 an hour in 2022, US dollars converted using the average annual conversion rate. The maximum that we saw across all states in Mexico was $250 an hour. So we're just showing to highlight that there's huge incentive to come work in the US to earn higher wages, particularly under the H-2A visa program, which might contribute to fewer workers being willing to migrate and work without legal documentation status when it's quite attractive to come in under the H-2A program if they can. Okay, so that's a potential upside. And I'll just highlight some spatial heterogeneity here. So this is in 2022. On the left-hand side here, we have the state or region adverse effect wage rates. And on the right-hand side, it's actually at the municipality level, the average daily wage for hired agricultural workers converted to US dollars. So the highest that we see in any municipality in Mexico is $20 a day, which is just above what you can earn in an hour under the highest paying H-2A AWAR in the US. Okay, and so what we are starting to see in Mexico are reports of worker shortages. And so this is potentially playing into this story. Why would I continue to work in Mexico when I could go to the US under the H-2A visa program, earn much more, come back? There's lots of awesome stories about people coming back and opening their own businesses and pursuing dreams in Mexico. But so we have this one piece, right? So H-2A program is potentially providing the solution from worker shortages. But then there's the second piece. Are the costs of the H-2A program sustainable for US farms? And so to answer that, we're going to draw comparisons between US Census of Agriculture data and Mexico Census of Agriculture data. And the point I want to make with the US Census of Ag data is thinking about how much of the rise in payroll costs have been offset by increases in farm sales, so increases in revenues. So here, I'm just showing you over time, the total farm payroll bills from the US Census of Agriculture. I broke it up between direct hire and contract labor expenses. From 2002 to 2022, so last 20 years of the US Census of Ag, farm payrolls have risen 236%. On average, farm sales have risen by more. So that's this red line on the right-hand axis. I was trying to get both in the same picture, so it's a little, not quite the same scale. But the point I want to make here is that farm sales have risen by more on average. So farm sales have risen over the same period by 270%. So that means that the average farm is better off today than they were 20 years ago. But I want to highlight that there's really important differences across the US and in particularly across commodities in terms of the comparison, how these numbers have changed across time. So here is a map of the US giving you the percentage increase in payroll costs by state over this 20-year time period. So we'll see that payroll costs have risen at varying levels if we look across the US. What I want to highlight in terms of comparing rising payroll costs to rising revenues or rising farm sales is that if we look at the Western states, payroll costs have outpaced growth in revenues for most Western states. So here, if we're looking at, let's pull out California, we have that revenues increased by 230% versus payroll costs increased by 244%. We see similar things in Washington and Oregon. And one exception that I will highlight is down here in Arizona. We saw that farm sales had a 217% increase versus a 170% increase in payroll costs. So this looks quite a bit different if we look at Midwestern states. And in most of these states, which I'll go into a little bit more detail as to why, but revenue growth has actually outpaced payroll increases in payroll costs. And so this is really what's driving that the average farm is better off if we're using these metrics, not what we're seeing in Western states. Okay. So I'll just kind of highlight here, I'll give some links at the end, but you can explore these data and hone in on your own state if you're interested. What I want to introduce is kind of this measure that I'm going to be using, which is essentially taking the total payroll costs divided by total farm sales. And I'm going to be referring to it as the payroll share of farm sales, which I think is a very useful metric for understanding agricultural competitiveness. So this is just giving a map of the US. This is just for highlighting for 2022, but I'm giving you national averages across time of the payroll share of farm sales. So here, darker colors would mean worse off, essentially. We have payroll costs make up a larger proportion of farm revenues. And we'll see that that's really concentrated among these counties along the coast and border of the US. So overall, what I want to dive into is that these geographic differences in terms of payroll share of farm sales are really driven by sectoral differences. So what these different areas focus on in terms of farm production. And the major driver is really that in the US, we have a huge competitive advantage in oilseed and grain production. So those Midwestern states being more competitive across time makes a lot of sense. So here in 2022, in the US, the payroll share of farm sales for oilseed and grains was 4.2%. And this is much lower than the payroll share of farm sales in the Mexican Census of Ag data, which was run also in 2022, which is why we're drawing these comparisons. So I will highlight here the Mexican Census of Ag data differentiates between jornaleros, which are these temporary seasonal workers. And it's easy to measure costs associated with jornaleros in their data. It's really hard actually to get a total labor bill cost, which would include permanent workers and yeah. So in the paper that Jay and I are working on this, we kind of inflate the jornalero bill by a bit to account for these permanent workers. So this last column is giving kind of our best estimates of what the actual payroll share of farm revenues is in Mexico. So the point here being that for oilseed and grains, the US has a huge competitive advantage using this metric. We have 4.2% of farm revenues are accounted for by the payroll bill versus in Mexico, 26%. And this is a lot of subsistence agriculture for maize production. By comparison, if we look at what's big commodities in California in particular, fruit and tree nut production, 36% of farm sales are accounted for by payroll costs in 2022. This is a drastic difference from what we see in the Mexico Census of Ag data, which is our best guess, 15%. So that's highlighting that for these particular commodities, I've highlighted in red, but particularly fruit and tree nuts, that there's a competitive advantage in Mexico because of the huge differentials in labor costs. Okay, and I want to just highlight this using kind of some more geographically disaggregated data. So in that map I showed before, it was in the US, it was showing payroll costs as a percent of farm sales for all commodities. Now let's break it up by these different sectors. So this is looking at oilseed and grains across the US, and we'll see that across all states, payroll costs as a share of farm revenues is really low across the US and generally much lower than what we see in most of Mexico. So here, I kept these scales the same, so it's always going to go from 0 to 30%. What looks a lot different is if we go to this fruit and tree nut sector. So here, again, 0 to 30%, almost all of the US has payroll shares of revenues that are above 30%. In Mexico, basically nowhere has payroll shares of farm revenues that are that high in fruit and tree nut production. So that's highlighting that if we're going to see some production moving into Mexico, it's going to be concentrated in these industries where payroll costs are rising more rapidly, where labor is a larger component of production costs. Just highlighting some reasons why I think that these numbers aren't really going to change. We can see state minimum wages are going to continue to rise. The AWR is likely to continue rising, and the H-2A dependence on H-2A workers is continuing to grow. I've done some work on California's overtime policies, which are spreading to other states. There's union laws. In general, we're just seeing a lot of factors contributing to growth in wages. So these trends are likely to continue. And so what are the impacts of this? And so this is what Jay and I are back here in Mexico looking to answer today, is we're trying to see if there's actual evidence of operations moving production to Mexico. And so our very preliminary analysis of this, and we're getting new data hopefully this week to expand. But just if we pull out berries, which, Phil made the point, is there's a big competitive advantage in Mexico. This is looking at Mexico berry production for strawberries, blackberries. I tried to use the colors associated with the berries. This is production in Mexico from 1995 to 2022. And if we look at how this translates to exports to the US, we see that for berries, this correlates really highly. So we're seeing increased production in these crops where Mexico has a competitive advantage in terms of lower labor costs, and we're seeing increased exports to the US for those crops. This looks quite a bit different if we look at some of the crops where the US has a competitive advantage. Mexico is producing very little in terms of soybean. They produce a lot of maize, but much lower share of it is exported to the US. So we see some spikes, but in general, in recent years, not huge exports of maize, definitely not huge exports of soybeans to the US, where we have a competitive advantage. So I'll wrap up here. I guess I should have given links. If you go to my website here and go to my projects page, you can explore those map data for your particular region. And we're going to be adding maps of the Mexico data as well. But I think within the next couple of weeks, we'll have those up on that same page. And so I really just want to come back to these initial points that I made. What's the outlook? Employees domestically are going to be continuing to be harder to find and more expensive to employ. The H-2A program offers this temporary solution, particularly addressing workers being harder to find. It's going to bring in new influxes of workers, but it's going to increase to costs. And so if we want to keep production within the US, we really need to find ways to make our businesses more competitive. So I've highlighted here increased revenues, because I think that that's something we don't talk enough about, but there's creating value-added products. There's also holding retailers accountable for us making all these efforts to have better working conditions in the US, and then just buying our products from other countries that don't have those same working conditions. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect there that should be addressed. And I will end there, and then we have a panel discussion.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you to all of today's panelists. We'll be opening the discussion to general audience questions now. And as a reminder, please remember to use the Q&A button to submit your questions and not the chat. Please also include your name and the organization with your question. The first question we've got, and I think this one is directed to Andrew Padovani. If your data is not capturing H-2A workers, how is this information relevant to estimating adverse effect wages? For example, the housing expenses might be relevant for workers living in the US, but not for those under the H-2A program. Also, knowing that something under the H-2A program are sent back to other countries where cost of living is lower than the US, how can we, for example, account for the relative earnings to cost of living to Mexico? Are H-2A workers better off?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the NAS is not used to determine the AWR, the AEWR wage. That's the Farm Labor Survey, which is a different survey. That survey is of employers directly, not of the workers themselves. And as far as the housing cost question, we have not looked directly at the differences in housing costs of workers in Mexico versus workers in the United States. As Ali mentioned, the wages are significantly higher in the United States versus Mexico. And there's a lot of workers who want to come to the US on H-2A visas to do farm work. So presumably they're better off for doing so, at least economically. I can't speak otherwise.
Phil or Allie, do either one of you want to chime in?
I mean, I can just say the AWR, as Michael said, is based on a survey that goes to about 12,000 farmers who hire workers directly, and about half of them respond. So it is only the direct hires that figure into the farm labor survey. It's USDA does not survey non-farm employers. The Department of Labor does not survey farm employers. So what's happened over time in USDA surveys is response rates are falling across everything, whether it's the price of wheat or anything else. And so the small sample in the farm labor survey means that the average hourly earnings from one year to the next can change a lot, 10, 15, 20% from one year to the next. And that's been a long-standing issue. But that's the survey that's used to set the AWR. What the NAWS is doing is it's not trying to get at the value. Well, the NAWS doesn't include H2A. The package that a H2A worker gets is the contract, which includes the minimum wage that's going to be paid. It's a guarantee for 3/4 of the hours that are promised. It includes all the cost incurred to get a visa in Mexico, to travel to the workplace, to be housed in the US, and then to be returned. So I think it's safe to sort of say that if let's suppose the AWR would be $20 an hour, depending on where you are, those additional costs can be anywhere from $5 to $8 an hour. Some farmers are paying $5 or $6 a night to house their workers. And so the housing is clearly part of that. But so the bottom line is, I think what I tried to say is H2A workers are going to be more expensive than workers settled in the US on a per hour basis. And the question for a farm employer deciding between US workers and H2A workers is, are those extra costs worth it in terms of having labor insurance? Workers will be there because they have a contract, the potentially higher productivity, and the savings on the Social Security. For some farmers, the answer is yes. For other farmers, the answer has been no. So that is it's farm employers who make that choice.
Allie, do you have anything to add on that question?
I think Phil did a pretty good job.
Okay. The next question we have is coming in from John McNamara, and it's kind of an interesting question because we heard this from some of the non-economics folks out at the Farm Foundation event with ERS in Santa Cruz. And John puts forth that all of the solutions put forward are on the supply of labor / cost of labor side. How about we change the paradigm to actually paying the true cost of food? We all know that literally pennies on the pound for food retail, with farmers getting the difference, will allow us to pay a living wage. He's been involved since 1968 on the farm classroom research, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, what do you think about this? Because I know that one of the challenges, and I think, Al, we saw it clearly in your research, was that farmers have a very difficult time moving upstream any of the additional costs that they have associated with the business enterprise on the farm.
Yeah, so Phil will probably have a good response to this one, but I do want to just give my 2 cents on it first, which is that's why I emphasize that I think these partnerships with retailers are really key to keeping production in the US as we institute these better and better working conditions for our farm workforce, and yet we don't really have anything mandating that we should be purchasing products from farm employers who are treating their workers better, who are paying living wages, who are doing these good things. And so, it can be really hard to remain competitive with other operations that don't have those same standards. And so I really think this is a kind of systemic issue. And I think it's a great question, John. I think it's incredibly important. But I think that it involves kind of an overhaul of the agricultural our agri-food system.
Thanks, Ali. Phil, do you have anything to add?
I mean, this goes to, it's a good question with no easy answer. I mean, they can look at it two different ways. First of all, Americans pay a relatively small share of their disposable income for food. We're closer to 10%, where France is more like 15%. But France faces exactly the same issues finding seasonal workers that the US does. And farmers in France, if you watch the news, they complain all the time about low prices and they have their tractors blocking things. So this is not an issue that's unique to the United States, where farmers are under pressure. Many people think that the answer is somehow reforming the food marketing and distribution system, because it is getting concentrated to where a handful of large supermarkets control of it. But the idea of somehow getting a higher price for farmers, because the price we pay doesn't reflect, in some sense, the true cost. You could also say that's true for oil and gas, depending on your views on climate change. You could say that's true on a whole lot of different commodities. So while you're raising a really good question, question being farmers don't get enough for their commodities. I think if you went to almost any other industry, almost everybody who produces something to sell mostly doesn't think they get enough of the price that consumers are paying. So while I think it's a good question, I think it's just far more complicated than we can answer in a short seminar. But I would urge you to think about looking at how other countries think about this and whether any other country has solved it. And what about other industries that are asking for a higher price, whether it's for that limited US production of furniture and shoes? They would make, if they were on, they would be making exactly the same point, that they can't get enough for their commodities, the products they produce. So it's a good question, but no easy answer.
Andrew, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Ali and Philip really covered it.
Okay, here's another question. Oops, my screen just shifted. So I have to move up to capture it. Thanishwar Bandari asks, is there any wage rate difference because of industry? Are wages higher for non-farm industries?
Yeah,
Well, yeah.
thank you. I assume you're asking about in Mexico?
That's not in the question, Ali.
But it's true in almost, can you think of any country where non-farm earnings are not higher, are lower than farm earnings? I think that's a universal.
Yeah, I can't either.
Yeah, and I will say the Mexican population census data can give you monthly earnings across different sectors, and it is the trends in earnings across time are rising similarly in farm work compared with other industries, but it's lower in farm work if you are asking about Mexico.
Yeah. Andrew, I'm going to toss a question past you because I am a really big fan of the work you guys are doing with the National Ag Worker Survey. And one of the things, when I was growing up, I remember seeing a lot of migrants coming up to hoe sugar beets or work on farms. What has occurred with that trend and migratory patterns of domestic workers actually moving for farm jobs in the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is they got older and they had families and they don't want to live that lifestyle anymore. And that's really the gist of it, is the workers are older and they've settled down, as Phil mentioned. And there is, so I do want to look more at our data. We actually collect county of work in that employment history. So every time a worker tells us, oh, I had, a job for this many weeks, we ask what county that job was in. So I want to look at whether there's still kind of workers are moving around, but they're moving around locally versus moving around, across a state or across states. But yeah, I mean, they've gotten older and they've settled and they're not going to they don't want to do follow the crop kind of work anymore.
Thanks, Andrew.
Sure.
Yeah, here's a question from Steve Bocher. How might the increased adoption of automation, robotics, AI, et cetera, by farm operations affect the set of skills farmers seek in their farm workers? Given the aging of the farm worker population, digital literacy or lack thereof could be an issue. Are there or should there be any training programs for current ag workers to help them update their skills? What do you guys think?
Well, I think if there's one message that comes from this, the cost of producing fresh fruits and vegetables in the US is going to go up. It's going to go up whether we automate, whether we bring in H2A workers and provide them housing, whether we move to controlled environment facilities near cities and have to build up greenhouses or something and hire from perhaps a different workforce. And the question is, who's going to fill the jobs in a more mechanized and automated future, farm? And will it be current workers who are retrained, or will it be new people coming in from the outside? And back in the 1960s, when we had relatively few Mexican-born workers in the United States, the US government put in place lots of programs to try to help the children of farm workers get out of agriculture. That was the whole point. The idea was we're going to mechanize everything. In fact, there's a famous report that predicted there would be no hand-harvested fruits and vegetables in the US by 1975. And that actually didn't happen. But the theory was you had to move very quickly to train people to get them out of agriculture. There is a lot of discussion of upskilling the current workforce. But I think, as Andrew mentioned, as Anna shows, if you have a worker who's approaching 50 and who's got a 7th or 8th or 9th grade education, that is probably going to be a tough road to upskill that person to deal with a robot. I think we're more likely to get younger people coming in to the industry who are much better educated than we are to upskill some of those older. Some of the older workers will upskill and go from picking to operating equipment. But in terms of developing and operating robotics, I guess my sense, what we've seen in other industries, when you put robots in auto factories, you don't get assembly line workers moving up. You get a new workforce with different training coming in. And I suspect we'll see a lot of that in agriculture as well.
Interesting. Well, here's a question, and this is going to be for you, Ali, because I've been getting questions from all kinds of media over the past couple of weeks, and I'm eager to hear about, this is from Liz Stelk, eager to hear from Dr. Hill about the potential impact of mass deportation on the workforce.
Yeah, so I think that you can intuitively imagine that getting rid of 40% of our workforce would be extremely detrimental. So in the immediate run, right, you can replace those workers with H2A workers at a really high premium. So at minimum, rising food costs, at maximum, a huge exodus of agriculture from the US. I think I will just also add that I'm working on doing a much more thorough answer to that question with some people who do what's called computable general equilibrium modeling, which is a very fancy way of saying we have all these giant algorithms that take into account trade flows between different countries and different attributes of production, and we're essentially modeling what the impacts of a reduction in 40% of the workforce would be for US agricultural production, for US agricultural wages, for rising imports from Mexico. So I'll have a better answer to that hopefully within a month or so. But in general, it's there would really need to be a policy that went along with it that somehow reduced costs of the H2A program or presented an avenue for a path to citizenship to to reduce the potential huge impacts of something like that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. A question for Andrew. In your survey, do you or could you ask about autoimmune conditions in farm workers?
We could ask about autoimmune conditions, although we would have to make sure that we ask that in a way that we could ensure that all the workers would, understand what conditions we were asking about and whatnot. But we certainly could. Most of the questions that make it into the survey either are, of DOL interest or come from outside agencies. So, for example, we work with CDC often and FDA and the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, the NIOSH. And so a lot of the health questions come from NIOSH or come from FDA. And there hasn't been interest recently in autoimmune disorders. So that's why we don't have any questions on autoimmune diseases, but we could ask questions. If you have funding, or we're happy to take it and ask some questions for you.
Thanks, Andrew. And that question was from Loretta Picciano. Here's one from Skylar Simnett, and this one's for you, Ali. Can you share with us your thought process behind expressing payroll expenses as a share of farm sales, as opposed to expressing payroll as a share of total production expenses?
Yeah, thank you, Skylar. So unfortunately, my preference would be to express it as a share of total production expenses. The reason we did not is because we were very purposefully trying to compare the US Census of Ag data with the Mexican Census of Ag data. And the Mexican Census of Ag data has phenomenal and very detailed information on worker costs. It actually gives you like the gender of workers, how many people you're hiring at different parts of the year, very detailed things that are not in the US Census of Ag. They have almost no information on other production expenses. So it was a data limitation in terms of comparing the US and Mexico data sources. So we could do that for the US Census of Ag, but then wouldn't be able to compare it. That's the trade-off.
Thanks, Ali. And the next one's from Cesar Escalante. Phil, I'm going to put this one over to you. And Cesar notes that the Farm Workforce Modernization Act has been turned down in the Senate 2 times in the past. The current version is still under review in the Congress. What are the chances that FWMA will be passed at all? And he points out that FWMA provides opportunities for livestock farms to use H2A, as they only account for 4% of H2A hires. What do you think, Phil?
Well, amnesty is always a hard sell, whether it's called amnesty or don't forget, amnesty almost failed in IRCA. It came very close. The vote was really close. And Charles Grassley, who was a senator, it's hard to believe it, he was a senator back then. He said, "You fooled me once, I'm never going to vote for amnesty again." He's going to head Senate Judiciary. So I have a hard time believing that we're going to see a legalization program in the next 4 years, 25 to 29. It could happen. I do think it's, remember we had Ag Jobs, which was a previous version. And we held a seminar in Washington in about 2007 or 8. It's hard to believe now, but there were the votes to pass it that year. And the Hispanic caucus blocked it. The Hispanic caucus blocked the Ag Jobs bill that would have legalized farm workers. And the reason was that they thought it was the easy one. And they said, if we let this go through to legalize farm workers and reform the H2A program, then we'll never get legalization for the other people, because the ag part was bipartisan. And I remember Howard Berman saying, this is a mistake. You get what you can at the time. But back in those days, people thought that if you had what was called the whole enchilada, you try to do everything at once in one big bill. That was the way to get things done. Now, of course, we've moved, and you try to get the Dreamers through if you can. You try to get the Farm Workforce Modernization Act through if you can. But at least initially, with the new administration having a very big enforcement push, I don't see much prospect. Michael is our Washington, D.C. expert, and he knows far better than I do. But I would be pessimistic about thinking that it will be approved in a Republican-run House or a Republican-run Senate in the near term.
Yeah, and just to chime in on that, Phil, I think you're right. It's going to have a very difficult road ahead, and of course, from the employer perspective, as we were negotiating that with United Farm Workers, the FWMA, we anticipated in the Senate that we would get a much more employer-friendly bill that we could then conference. And unfortunately, that did not occur when Senator Bennett from Colorado introduced his legislation, which was the companion bill. There really wouldn't have been anything or much there for us to actually conference in that respect. So, and I agree, coming into this administration with very narrow margins we're going to have in both the Senate as well as in the House, it's going to be very challenging to advance ag labor reform. But it's something we can't stop trying, because I've got a lot of friends that are in the dairy industry around the United States and in livestock industries, just as Caesar points out, and they have to have some access to workforce. Even though I've had some dairy farmers switch over to using robots, not all the cows are all that comfortable having robots there instead of people. So we've got some work to do for sure. Ben and Abrams asked a question. If the AWAR wasn't based on the Farm Labor Survey, or the FLS was significantly reformed, what might that look like? And I'll toss in my first 2 cents. One is that perhaps you have a wage rate that's connected to the marketplace for ag labor around the globe. That might be one way to do that. Or perhaps instead of including in average gross wages in the Farm Labor Survey, having overtime, piece rate, bonus, other types of incentive payments included, perhaps you could scale that back to actually what is the base rate, wage rate that you're paying to workers. But Ali, Andrew, Phil, please chime in.
I mean, I can say that the AWAR was introduced in the late 1950s, and it's probably important to remember why it was introduced. At the time, U.S. farm workers were not covered by the minimum wage. So the AWAR was put in place to protect U.S. workers at a time when U.S. farm workers weren't covered by the minimum wage. It's obviously evolved over time. It had several different ways it was calculated, but most years it's been done using the Farm Labor Survey. I think the big change, even from 1987, when it went to the current kind of structure, is the growth of outsourcing of labor to non-farm employers who are not included in the Farm Labor Survey. And there's a lot of things we could talk about the Farm Labor Survey itself, the gross versus base and all that kind of thing. But it is true that labor contractors tend to pay lower wages, and they are not well surveyed either by the Department of Labor, and they're not surveyed at all by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So what would a reform look like? Well, you could wind up saying that since minimum wage laws now cover farm workers in most states, I guess there are still some states where they are not covered, that you just use the minimum. That's what some other countries do. You could also say something along the lines of whatever the AWAR is, you'll increase it by the employment cost index. So the employment cost index is a huge survey, and it combines both, you can have it wages only or wages and benefits. And that's what the Department of Labor proposed to use when the USDA in 2020 announced it was stopping the Farm Labor Survey. It wouldn't have changed the level, but it would have said from now on, the AWAR will go up by the employment cost index, which is actually used to index certain kinds of wages and benefits. So it's hard to know, exactly what the alternative would be.
Yeah. And Andrew or Ali, do you have anything to add? Okay. Here's a comment from Beverly Collins Hall. Thank you for the information. American Indian Mothers, Inc. has been around for 24 years. We enjoy working with all cultures. Thank you for that, Beverly. Cesar Escalante brings up that livestock wages are on average higher than crop wages. Do livestock farms experience the same domestic labor hiring predicament that most crop farms have, such that crop farms end up relying more on H-2A labor? I can add my 2 cents there. Yeah, in my experience working with dairy for a long time out in California, there were very few workers who ever showed up on the farm who were not immigrants in the first place. But and you are correct that the livestock wages are typically on average higher than crop wages. But even though those wages are higher, it's very rare that you're able to recruit somebody to get them out on the farm. And you raise a great point, Cesar. H-2A simply for those year-round jobs is not available. Phil, Ali, or Andrew, do you have anything to add?
I mean, dairy is the biggest single component of livestock agriculture, and typically dairy farmers often provided housing and sometimes other benefits, but we don't really know what share. We don't, since the NAWS doesn't cover it, we don't really have good data on the demographics or anything of people in the dairy who hired workers in the dairy industry. But clearly, the immigrant share there is fairly high, and I assume that the dairy farmers would wind up hiring H-2A workers if they could. I mean, I just might point out that probably the highest share, one of the highest shares of total workforce that's H-2A is in the sheep herding business in the Western states, because, there we're bringing in workers, and I don't know how many US workers are doing sheep herding in the mountains, but I suspect it's a relatively small share of the total. And the same might be said of fish processing in Alaska, though that's a lot H-2B. It's a mix of H-2A and H-2B. So whenever you get these remote jobs, you do tend to get a higher share of H-2A. And so but I think the whole point that Cesar's making is that even though earnings do tend to be slightly higher in livestock, the dependence on immigrants is not significantly different, I don't think, but we really just don't have good data.
And respond very quickly to Angeli Poyer's question about source of the data for Saskatchewan and British Columbia wage data. That comes from the provincial wage data for fruit and vegetable workers in those individual provinces. And of course, we've gone ahead and adjusted those for the exchange rate that we had on the slide. And I believe that's all the time we have for questions today, but obviously, based upon the number of questions we had, this was really a very provocative event, and I'm glad that we were able to get so much good discussion in. And Tim, I'm going to turn it back to you. Thank you, everybody.
I want to thank the panel for this wonderful discussion today. I'd also like to thank all of you in the audience for joining us and submitting your questions. We appreciate your engagement with us and would love to hear your feedback. So please take a moment to share your comments about today's session in the brief survey you'll see at the conclusion of this forum. And if you'd like to help us continue providing valuable programming such as today's forum, I'll quickly remind you about becoming a friend of Farm Foundation. Check the link that we provided in the chat to learn more. Each and every gift to Farm Foundation strengthens our ability to address rapidly evolving issues impacting agriculture, the food system, and rural communities. And we're very grateful for your support. We'd also like to invite you to join us for our next Farm Foundation Forum called Tax Year 2025, Potential Impacts and Opportunities for Farmers in the Agricultural Sector. It will take place on December 12th, again starting at 9 a.m. Central Standard Time via Zoom, and we'll share a registration link in the survey email you'll receive shortly. Thank you once again for joining us today, and we'll now conclude this forum.